Jessica Price sat at her small desk in the local library of New Haven, Connecticut, the soft hum of pages turning surrounding her. It was a peaceful day, the kind she used to dream about. Her fingers brushed the edges of a worn paperback, the smell of aged paper calming her racing mind. But deep down, something gnawed at her, an unease that had settled into her chest years ago. A quiet sadness lingered behind her warm smile, the one she shared with everyone, as though the world outside would never know the turmoil building within. At 34, Jessica had built a life that seemed flawless from the outside. She was married to Nicholas Price, a rising star in the tech world, and together they had a picture-perfect home in the quiet suburban town of Woodbridge. To their neighbors, they were the epitome of success, young, successful, in love. Yet, as the days turned into months and then years, Jessica began to realize that the fairy tale she had longed for wasn't so easily obtained. Nicholas, 36, was always buried in his work, his mind consumed by codes, algorithms, and business meetings. He had recently landed a promotion at a tech startup in Hartford, a city only 20 minutes away, but the distance between them seemed to grow with every passing day. He was no longer the attentive, doting husband who had swept her off her feet during their whirlwind romance. No, Nicholas was a man who lived for his career, and Jessica was left with the hollow ache of a love that was beginning to fade. Jessica had always dreamed of having a family, children to fill their home with laughter, a life brimming with the warmth of love. She had envisioned bedtime stories, birthday parties, and a house that echoed with the sounds of little feet. But as the months turned into years, the pregnancy tests remained negative, each one a crushing reminder that her dream of motherhood was slipping further away. She had gone through countless rounds of IVF, each one a painful reminder of her body's failure. The doctors had been kind, offering support and explanations, but nothing could heal the growing wound in Jessica's heart. And Nicholas, who once promised to be by her side through thick and thin, had retreated further into himself. His answers to her concerns about their infertility became more dismissive, his late nights at the office longer, his excuses for not being home more frequent. The woman who had once been his partner was now a shadow in his life, someone to be dealt with only when necessary. It wasn't just the pressure of infertility that weighed on Jessica. It was the constant comparisons to the families around her, the perfect families. Her friends, once supportive, now spoke only of their children, their growing families, their endless joy. Every conversation was a reminder of what she couldn't have. Even Nicholas's mother, Eleanor, a woman with high expectations and no tolerance for failure, began questioning why they hadn't started a family yet. Jessica's smile began to feel more like a mask, a facade she wore to shield herself from the painful reality. The woman in the mirror seemed like someone else, a woman who had once been full of hope, now lost in the quiet ache of longing. And then, the guilt began to settle in. The guilt of wanting something so desperately, of wanting Nicholas to be happy, to love her, but knowing that no matter what she did, she couldn't give him the one thing he desired most, a child. But what if there was another way? What if she could make it happen? What if, just for a little while, she could give him the family he wanted, the one they both dreamed of? It was a dangerous thought, one that would push her to the edge, but in her darkest moments, it was the only thing that made sense. Jessica didn't know it yet, but the moment she decided to fake a pregnancy would set in motion a chain of events far darker than she could ever have imagined. The house was eerily quiet that night, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustling of the wind outside the only sounds that filled the space. Jessica sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea, the steam rising in delicate tendrils. Her gaze was fixed on the dark window, her reflection a shadow of the woman she used to recognize. The life she had once dreamed of, a family, laughter, children, seemed like an unreachable dream. She could feel the distance growing between her and Nicholas every day, the coldness creeping in slowly, insidiously. Once, their home had been filled with warmth, with conversations that stretched late into the night, dreams of the future shared with excitement and hope. But now, There was only silence, long stretches of silence punctuated by Nicholas's late-night work calls and his growing indifference. The man who once promised her the world was slipping away from her grasp, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to bridge the widening gap between them. Nicholas had become consumed by his career. His ambition, once something she admired, now felt suffocating. The long hours at the tech startup in Hartford, the constant travel, the late-night meetings, it was all too much. And each time he came home, the distance between them grew. He barely noticed her attempts to reconnect, to share her feelings of loneliness and fear. His focus was always on his work. Their conversations had turned into routine exchanges, barely touching on anything real. The passion they once had faded into the background, replaced by frustration and silence. Jessica tried to reach him, to talk to him about their struggle to conceive, to explain how much it hurt to keep facing failure after failure. But whenever she broached the subject, Nicholas would change the topic, shrugging it off with the tired excuse of work stress or fatigue. It was as if their infertility was no longer something he wanted to address. He simply buried himself deeper in his work, leaving Jessica to face the emotional toll alone. As months passed, Jessica felt more and more isolated. She had undergone multiple rounds of IVF, each one more painful than the last, both physically and emotionally. The constant reminder that her body couldn't give Nicholas the child he so desperately wanted left her questioning her worth. What kind of wife was she if she couldn't fulfill that most basic expectation? The loneliness was overwhelming. Every morning, she woke up alone, had her breakfast alone, and spent her days in the quiet of the library, shelving books, lost in the stories of others while her own life seemed to stand still. She yearned for something, anything, to fill the emptiness inside. Her friends, many of whom had children by now, had become distant. They no longer understood the pain she was going through, the ache that seemed to swallow her whole. It wasn't just the infertility that was breaking her, though, it was the realization that Nicholas seemed to care less and less. There were days when she would hear him on the phone with his colleagues late into the night, his voice full of energy as he discussed his latest project or presentation. But when he spoke to her, it was like talking to a stranger. The affection, the little gestures of love that once came so easily, were gone. It was the little things that ate away at her, the coldness when they kissed goodbye in the morning, the distant way he looked at her, as if she were no longer the woman he married. The warmth they had once shared had evaporated, replaced by frustration, regret, and a creeping feeling of betrayal. It was during one of these moments of intense loneliness that Jessica began to notice something unsettling. Nicholas had always been an open book, until recently. Now, his behavior was shifting in subtle ways. He'd come home late, his shirt wrinkled as if he'd been out longer than usual. He would sometimes slip his phone into his pocket or angle the screen away from her when she walked into the room. There were unexplained charges on their credit card statement, restaurant bills she didn't recognize, places they'd never been. Her heart pounded with an uneasy feeling, one she couldn't shake. One evening, as Nicholas rushed out the door for what he claimed was another emergency at work, Jessica caught a glimpse of his phone screen. The text message was short but telling. "Can't wait to see you tonight, miss your touch." The sender's name was just a letter, A. It hit her like a bolt of lightning, her breath catching in her throat. A wave of nausea swept over her as her suspicions crystallized into painful certainty. Her mind raced. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the ground beneath her feet suddenly unstable. She had been trying so hard to ignore the little signs, the late nights, the phone distractions, the sudden aloofness, but now it all made sense. That night, Jessica lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of what she had just uncovered. How had it come to this? The thought of confronting Nicholas terrified her, but the thought of doing nothing, of allowing this to continue, was unbearable. She spent hours crying, alternating between angry outbursts and fits of deep, gut-wrenching despair. She had loved him with everything she had, trusted him, and now she was faced with the bitter reality that he had betrayed her. When Nicholas finally came home in the early hours of the morning, she didn't know what to expect. But when he stepped through the door, all she could see was the man she once adored, now distant, a stranger. Her heart ached, but the rage inside her burned hotter. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Where the hell have you been?" Nicholas looked at her, his face a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. "What's wrong, Jess?" "I was at the office. You know how it is." But Jessica wasn't having it. She pushed him, her voice trembling but fierce. "I saw the text, Nicholas. The one from Don't lie to me." His face paled, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door as if seeking an escape. But there was no way out. Nicholas hesitated, guilt written all over his face, before his shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt you, but I've been feeling so disconnected from everything. I didn't know how to handle it anymore." His words fell flat. The excuses only made it worse. To Jessica, every explanation felt like another jab at her heart. The truth was, in that moment, Jessica didn't just feel betrayed by Nicholas. She felt betrayed by everything, by the life they had built, by her own hopes for the future, by her desperate need to hold on to a marriage that was slipping away. And in the depths of her despair, the thought crossed her mind again, clearer than ever. What if she could still fix this? What if a baby, the one thing they both desperately wanted, could save their marriage? The idea bloomed in her mind, and though it was dark, twisted, and impossible, it offered her a glimpse of hope. It would be her only chance. And so, the decision was made. She would do anything to keep Nicholas. Even if it meant creating a life that wasn't real. The next few days after Nicholas's confession were a blur of emotions for Jessica: anger, humiliation, despair, but most of all, a gnawing, desperate need for a solution. Her mind raced in circles, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, of the betrayal that had shattered the fragile trust they had left. She felt like a stranger in her own life, like a woman caught between two worlds, one where she could move on, rebuild, and live without Nicholas, and another where she could hold on to the dream of their perfect life, a life that had once been so simple, so filled with hope. But now, that dream felt impossible to achieve without a drastic change. And that change, she realized, could be one thing: a child. The thought haunted her. It was the only thing that had ever brought them close, the one thing they both wanted more than anything. If she could give Nicholas that, if she could give him the child he had always dreamed of, maybe, just maybe, their marriage could be saved. It didn't matter if it was real or not, what mattered was that it would give him a reason to stay, a reason to fight for their relationship. The empty space in their marriage could be filled by this one miracle. The idea was twisted, perverse even, but in the darkest corners of her mind, it felt like her only option. Jessica spent the next few days in a daze, planning each step with meticulous care. She knew she couldn't just pretend to be pregnant, she needed proof, something Nicholas and everyone around them would believe. She couldn't afford to be caught in a lie, not this time. Her first stop was the local pharmacy. She bought a variety of pregnancy tests, many of them, carefully selected for their accuracy and reliability. The tests she used were the kind that guaranteed a faint line, just enough to make it seem real. In the privacy of her bathroom, she carefully opened the packages, replacing the negative tests with the positive ones she had purchased online. They were nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. No one would question them. Jessica's fingers trembled as she placed the fake tests in the bathroom trash, knowing that Nicholas's curiosity would get the better of him. She had to be patient, make him believe without pushing him too hard, without seeming too eager. She had seen how easy it was to deceive him when he wasn't paying attention. The hard part, she knew, would be making him believe it over time. Her next move was to create a paper trail, one that Nicholas couldn't easily question. She'd always been good with design, and years of creating flyers for library events had given her the skills she now needed to forge ultrasound images. The soft glow of the computer screen illuminated her face as she carefully designed the images, replicating what she had seen online, making sure every detail was perfect. The images looked real, believable. She created a fake email address, Dr. Amanda Turner, a name she had chosen from a list of common but forgettable names, and began sending herself emails from this supposed obstetrician. The messages were filled with medical jargon, the kind that would sound authoritative but would raise no suspicion. The final touch was perhaps the most important. She needed the world to believe her pregnancy, not just Nicholas, but their friends, their family. She had to create something tangible that would convince everyone, even herself, that it was real. She bought pregnancy journals, filling them with carefully written entries that chronicled her so-called journey. They were filled with hopes, fears, and dreams of motherhood, each entry designed to pull Nicholas further into her web of lies. She knew he would never read them fully, he had never been the type to pry, but their mere presence, scattered around the house, would lend an air of authenticity to her deception. The journals would become her new reality, and she would live in them, breathing life into the lie every day. With each passing hour, Jessica's anxiety grew, but so did her resolve. She was doing this for them, for Nicholas, for the family they were meant to have. This was her chance, and she had to seize it. The following evening, as Nicholas worked late again in his office, Jessica felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had planned every detail carefully, but now the moment had come. The truth was, there was no turning back. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, clutching one of the fake pregnancy tests. Her reflection seemed to mock her, a woman on the verge of breaking. But she straightened her back, wiped the tears that had been threatening to fall, and walked to Nicholas's office. With trembling hands, she knocked softly on the door. "Nicholas, I need to talk to you," she called out, her voice thick with emotion. Nicholas looked up, his tired eyes momentarily registering surprise. "What's wrong?" Her voice faltered, and she had to swallow hard. "I took another test. And it's positive." For a moment, he stared at her, confusion and disbelief flickering across his face. Then, slowly, his expression softened, and his lips parted. Are you serious?" Jessica held out the test, her hands shaking. "I'm pregnant, Nicholas," she said, her voice trembling, but with a strange sense of triumph that quickly mingled with guilt. Nicholas stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the test in her hand. For a second, time seemed to freeze. And then, his face broke into a smile so full of relief and joy that Jessica felt her heart break and heal in the same instant. "Oh my God, Jess," he said, rushing toward her, his arms wide open. This is everything I've wanted." Tears filled Jessica's eyes as she allowed herself to be enveloped in his embrace. She had done it. She had given him the one thing that could save their marriage. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe in the lie. But deep down, she knew it was only the beginning of something far darker. The lie she had created would soon consume her, and the consequences would be far more than she could ever imagine. As Nicholas held her, promising to be a better husband, to be there for their child, Jessica's stomach churned with both relief and dread. This was the beginning of a new chapter. And she had no idea where it would lead. The weeks that followed Jessica's announcement felt like a fragile dream, a world she created from nothing but lies, and yet Nicholas embraced it fully, his joy apparent in every conversation, every smile, every touch. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple once again, their broken marriage seemingly healed by the news of their pregnancy. But for Jessica, the guilt gnawed at her constantly, a constant reminder of the deception she was weaving. In the beginning, she basked in the warmth of Nicholas's attention. He began attending every so-called doctor's appointment, asking questions, hovering over her with genuine concern. He insisted on taking time off from work to be with her, supporting her through what he believed was a high-risk pregnancy. It felt almost normal, like the future they had once envisioned, like a fairy tale come to life. But the fairy tale was just that, a story. And in the back of her mind, Jessica knew it was only a matter of time before cracks began to show. She hadn't prepared herself for the intensity of the lie she was living, nor for the subtle signs that would begin to surface, threatening to unravel everything she had worked so hard to build. The first sign came in the form of a casual comment from one of Nicholas's friends. Ethan Price, a childhood friend and now a pediatrician in a nearby town, had invited them both to dinner one evening. As they sat around the table, enjoying a quiet meal, Ethan casually asked Jessica about her doctor, Dr. Amanda Turner, the one who was supposedly overseeing her pregnancy. Ethan had worked with pediatricians in the area for years, and he had never heard of a Dr. Amanda Turner, a fact he casually mentioned over dessert. Jessica froze mid-bite, her fork clinking against her plate. Her heart thudded in her chest as she forced a smile. "Oh, she's just recently joined the practice," she explained quickly, but even to her own ears, the explanation sounded weak, unconvincing. Nicholas, who had been lost in conversation with Ethan, suddenly looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I thought Dr. Turner worked out of Yale New Haven," he said, his voice curious but not yet suspicious. Jessica nodded quickly, her pulse racing. "Yes, that's right. She's a specialist in high-risk pregnancies, very well known." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly still unsure, but nodded politely. "Ah, well, I'll have to look into her sometime," he said, but Jessica could feel the unease in his words. Ethan didn't let it go, but the small seed of doubt had been planted in Nicholas's mind. That night, as they lay in bed, Nicholas's voice broke through the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, turning to face Jessica. "I've been meaning to call Dr. Turner. I want to make sure everything is on track for the baby. Maybe we could schedule that 3D ultrasound we've talked about." Jessica's heart sank. The 3D ultrasound was something she had never planned for, a step that would bring them closer to the moment of truth, the birth. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the lie on her shoulders growing heavier. I don't think we need that right now," Jessica stammered. "The regular checkups are enough. I'm still early in the pregnancy, and the doctor said we don't need to rush into that just yet." Nicholas's face softened, but there was a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "Okay, but let's make sure we get it soon. I want to be part of all of this. I want to be involved." Jessica nodded quickly, trying to hide her anxiety, but inside, she was panicking. Nicholas was starting to notice the cracks in her story. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and she could feel the walls closing in. The next few days were a whirlwind of unease. Nicholas grew more distant, his mind clearly preoccupied. He had started asking more pointed questions, the kind that made Jessica's stomach churn. He wanted more details about the doctor's appointments, the symptoms she was experiencing, and how the pregnancy was progressing. Jessica struggled to keep up with her lies, spinning increasingly elaborate explanations to cover up the growing holes in her story. One evening, as Nicholas was scrolling through his phone, his face suddenly darkened. He had been researching pregnancy complications, trying to educate himself, and something on his screen caught his eye. He turned to Jessica, his face unreadable. "Jessica," he said slowly, "I've been looking up placenta previa. The condition you mentioned, it doesn't explain why you're not showing yet. According to what I've read, women with that condition typically start showing by now. Why hasn't your bump grown at all?" Jessica's blood ran cold. She had been so careful, so meticulous, but Nicholas was starting to question the details. She hadn't expected him to dig so deep into her lies, and now she was caught. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It's rare," she said, forcing a smile. "Some women don't show for several months, especially with this condition. I've read that it's normal." The doctor assured me it's fine. Nicholas didn't look convinced, but he said nothing more. The doubt lingered in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Jessica knew that the next time he had a question, she wouldn't be able to lie her way out of it. The cracks in their marriage, once small and imperceptible, were now widening. The foundation she had built her deception on was starting to crumble, piece by piece. Every time she spoke, the lie felt heavier, more dangerous. And as much as she longed for the fairy tale, Jessica knew she was inching closer to a breaking point, a moment when everything would come crashing down. One afternoon, as Nicholas returned home from a work trip, he came into the kitchen, his face pale, his eyes dark with something that wasn't quite anger but more a quiet, simmering frustration. He had been looking at something he shouldn't have found. "I've been doing some more digging, Jessica," he said, his voice tight. "I called around. There's no Dr. Amanda Turner. She doesn't exist." Jessica's heart stopped. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the truth bearing down on her. The final thread of her web had been snapped, and the deception was about to unravel completely. The air in their home had become thick with tension. Every conversation, every glance exchanged between Jessica and Nicholas seemed to hold a weight that neither could escape. The small lies she had spun, once so easily dismissed, were now taking root in their marriage like a poison. Jessica could feel the walls closing in, the truth pressing against her from every side. Each day brought a new wave of anxiety, a new fear that the life she had carefully constructed would come crashing down. The pregnancy was no longer a promise of salvation but a ticking time bomb, one she knew she could not keep hidden forever. Nicholas had grown distant, though he never spoke of his suspicions outright. He was quieter now, his eyes sharper, always looking for the cracks in her story. She could sense his distrust, his growing discomfort whenever she deflected his questions. But it wasn't just his questions that were eating away at her, it was the silence between them, the unspoken tension that had replaced the warmth they had once shared. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow through their living room windows, Jessica sat nervously at the kitchen table. She had been staring at the same glass of water for over an hour, the sound of Nicholas's footsteps echoing in her ears as he moved through the house. He had just returned from a business trip, and though he had greeted her with a distracted kiss on the cheek, she could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on her. The truth was coming for her, and she knew it. Nicholas stepped into the kitchen, his face pale and drawn. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, there was a heavy silence, an almost suffocating stillness between them. Jessica could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last. "I know, Jessica," Nicholas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know everything." Jessica's stomach lurched, the words landing like a blow to her chest. She had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the crushing weight of his words. She tried to speak, but no sound came from her lips. Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, she could only stare at him, paralyzed by the inevitability of what was to come. "Nicholas, please," she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't mean for it to get this far. You lied to me," he interrupted, his voice steady but cold, the pain in his eyes cutting through her like a knife. "You lied about everything, about the pregnancy, about the doctor, about us. This wasn't just about wanting a child. This was about you, about your need to keep me, to control me, to make sure I wouldn't leave you. I trusted you, Jessica." Her heart clenched as the truth began to sink in. Nicholas was right. Everything she had done, every decision, every lie, it was all driven by her fear of losing him. But now, as she looked at him, she saw the betrayal in his eyes, the realization that he had been deceived by the one person he thought he could trust. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I gave you what you wanted, if I gave us the family we always talked about, you would stay. I couldn't lose you, Nicholas." I couldn't bear the thought of being alone. Nicholas looked at her, his expression a mixture of hurt and disbelief. I never asked you to do this. I never asked you to deceive me. And I never wanted a child just to fix a broken marriage. The words hit her like a slap, the sting of his rejection cutting deeper than any physical blow could. She had believed, so desperately, that this lie could save them, that it could bring back the man she had fallen in love with. But now, in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, she saw the damage she had done. The trust was gone. There was no going back. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The weight of everything unsaid hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. And then, something in Jessica snapped. The panic, the fear, the overwhelming guilt, it all came crashing down on her. She couldn't let him leave. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him after everything she had done to keep him. Please, she begged, her voice frantic. Please don't leave me. I can fix this. I'll make it right, I promise. But Nicholas stood there, unmoving, his face hardening as he shook his head. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Jessica. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were. The damage is done. The finality in his voice sent a chill through her. His words were a death sentence to the future she had built in her mind, a future where everything was perfect again. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, desperate, but he stepped back, his eyes cold, distant. I can't do this, he muttered. I need some space. I need to think. Jessica stood there, frozen, as he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. The finality of his words echoed in her mind, each step he took away from her a sharp reminder of what she had lost. But in that moment, a darker thought began to creep into her mind. She couldn't let him go. She couldn't lose him. Not after everything she had done, not after everything she had worked so hard to create. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her vision blurred with tears. She knew what she had to do. She didn't have a choice anymore. As Nicholas disappeared into the guest room, Jessica stood at the top of the stairs, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. She could feel the storm inside her building, a whirlwind of rage, fear, and desperation. She couldn't fix this. But maybe, just maybe, she could stop it from falling apart completely. With trembling hands, she moved toward the door to the guest room, her mind racing. And as she reached for the handle, her heart stopped. In that instant, the last thread of control she had slipped away. A push. A moment of desperation. And the world she had so carefully constructed crumbled into darkness. The days following the confrontation were a blur for Jessica. The silence in their home was deafening, broken only by the occasional, strained conversation. Nicholas, ever the analytical mind, had retreated into himself, spending hours researching, questioning, digging for answers. Jessica, on the other hand, was consumed by a whirlwind of guilt and fear, each hour ticking by like a countdown to her inevitable downfall. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, the storm would pass. That Nicholas would eventually forgive her, and they could somehow rebuild their life together. But deep down, she knew it was too late. The cracks in their marriage were no longer something that could be repaired with a lie. The damage had already been done, and there was no going back. Nicholas had begun his own investigation, though Jessica hadn't realized just how far he had gone. It started with small, inconspicuous questions about her supposed doctor, Dr. Amanda Turner, who she had created to cover up her deception. Nicholas, ever the curious one, had made a few discreet inquiries at Yale New Haven Hospital, where she had claimed Dr. Turner worked. When he discovered that no such doctor existed, he had grown suspicious, but it wasn't until he took it a step further that the truth truly began to reveal itself. One afternoon, while Jessica was in the kitchen, preparing a late lunch, she heard the sound of Nicholas's footsteps coming down the stairs. Her heart skipped a beat, her stomach tightening as she saw him enter the room, his face unusually calm, almost cold. I know everything, Jessica, Nicholas said, his voice quiet, but laced with an undeniable weight of certainty. Jessica's blood ran cold. She could feel her throat closing up, her hands trembling as she wiped them nervously on her apron. What do you mean? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Nicholas didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of papers. They were the ultrasound images she had forged, the ones that had once seemed so perfect, so real. He slammed them down on the kitchen table, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent room. Do you really think I wouldn't notice? He asked, his voice now edged with anger. Do you really think I wouldn't recognize a fake when I see it? The pictures, the emails, none of it makes sense, Jessica. I've been looking for the truth, and I found it. Jessica's mind raced. She knew the moment had come. Her lies had been exposed, and there was no escape. She couldn't talk her way out of this. She couldn't deny what had happened. The fake pregnancy tests, the forged medical documents, the fake doctor, all of it was laid bare before her. The web she had carefully woven had finally unraveled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. All she could do was stare at Nicholas, her heart breaking into pieces, knowing that this was the moment their marriage, their life, would come to an end. Nicholas's face twisted in a mix of disbelief and hurt. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth, his anger palpable. Why, Jessica? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why would you do this? Why would you go to such extremes to keep a lie alive? Was our marriage really that broken that you thought this was the only way out? I didn't know what else to do, Jessica whispered, her voice barely above a sob. I was afraid. I couldn't stand the thought of losing you. I thought if I gave you the one thing you wanted, if I could give us the family we both dreamed of, everything would go back to the way it was. But you didn't give me a family, Jessica, Nicholas snapped. You gave me a lie. You built this entire fantasy around us, around a child that isn't even real, and now look at what it's cost us. Look at what it's cost you. His words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper into her chest. The guilt was unbearable, but the worst part was knowing that her actions had destroyed the one thing she had tried so hard to protect, their marriage. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Neither of them spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Nicholas broke the silence, his voice quieter now, tinged with sadness. I've been to the police, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The things you've done, they have consequences. You can't just pretend like everything's going to be okay. This isn't something you can fix with a few apologies. Jessica's heart dropped. She had known, on some level, that the consequences of her actions would catch up with her. But hearing it from Nicholas, hearing him say it aloud, made it all too real. She had gone too far, and there was no turning back. The police investigation began quickly after that. The evidence was overwhelming, the forged documents, the fake pregnancy tests, the meticulously planned lie that Jessica had woven for months. As the details of her deception came to light, it wasn't just her marriage that was at stake anymore, it was her freedom. The investigators were thorough, interviewing friends, family, and colleagues. Jessica's parents, once so proud of her and her accomplishments, were devastated by the truth. They couldn't understand how their daughter had fallen so far, had allowed her desperation to drive her to such extremes. The shame weighed on them all, but for Jessica, the guilt was far more suffocating. By the time the police had gathered all the evidence they needed, Jessica knew her fate was sealed. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions. She had betrayed Nicholas in the worst way possible, and now, she was facing the harsh reality of her own mistakes. The trial came quickly. The prosecution had a strong case, one built not just on the deception but on the emotional toll it had taken on everyone involved. The lies Jessica had told had not only destroyed her marriage but had also torn apart her family, her reputation, and her sense of self. Jessica sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling as she listened to the testimonies, her eyes never leaving Nicholas. He had testified, his voice unwavering as he spoke about the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the destruction that had followed. The pain in his eyes was too much for her to bear. He had been the one person she had never wanted to hurt, and now she had done exactly that. The jury deliberated for hours, but the verdict was inevitable. Jessica was found guilty of second-degree manslaughter, a charge that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The judge, though compassionate, had no choice but to sentence her to 15 years in prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, her heart felt as though it had shattered into 1,000 pieces. She had lost everything, her husband, her freedom, and the future she had once dreamed of. The fairy tale she had tried to create had turned into a nightmare, and now she would have to live with the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. The investigation, the trial, and the unraveling of Jessica's deception had shattered not only her marriage but also the image of the perfect life she had tried so hard to maintain. The truth had come crashing down, and there was no escaping the fallout. The prison walls closed in around Jessica, and with each passing day, the weight of her actions became more suffocating. It was the first time in months, maybe years, that she allowed herself to face the consequences of what she had done. She had built her world on a lie, and now, as she sat in her small cell, there was no escaping the reality of her choices. She had thought that deceiving Nicholas would solve everything, that pretending to be pregnant, creating a future they never had, would somehow repair the damage in their marriage. But the truth was far uglier. She had sacrificed her own integrity, the love they shared, and ultimately her freedom, all for the hope that she could control something, anything, that would bring her back to the perfect family she so desperately desired. It wasn't just Nicholas that she had betrayed, it was everyone who had trusted her. Her parents, who once looked at her with pride, could no longer even speak her name without pain and shame. Her friends, who had been swept up in her lies, felt foolish and deceived. They had all believed in the future she had promised, the future she had fabricated. And now, as she sat alone, the walls of the prison seemed to close in, reminding her of the harsh truth that would never leave her, the lie she had lived had destroyed everything. As the months passed, Jessica had time to reflect. Time to wonder how it had all gone so terribly wrong. She couldn't help but question her own decisions, the desperation that had led her to manipulate the one person she loved most. How had she let fear drive her to such extremes? She thought of Nicholas, of the pain she had caused him, of the trust that could never be rebuilt. She thought of the life they could have had if only she had been honest with him, with herself. In prison, Jessica was forced to confront the stark reality of her choices. The life she had taken for granted, her marriage, her home, her future, was gone. She had ruined everything. The small comforts of her past life now felt like distant memories, things she could never return to. Her trial had captivated the local community, the case making headlines across the state. The image of the woman who had seemingly been the picture of perfection, only to be exposed as a manipulator, a liar, and someone capable of a crime as horrific as manslaughter, shook everyone who had known her. People talked about her in hushed tones, and some even wondered how far someone could go to hold on to the illusion of happiness. But Jessica wasn't the only one affected by her lies. Nicholas, though he had testified in the trial, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. His grief wasn't just for the loss of his wife, but for the loss of the future he had dreamed of. The trust he had placed in Jessica, the hope he had had for their family, had been cruelly taken away from him. Despite everything, though, there was a part of Nicholas that still mourned the woman he had married, the woman she had once been. He couldn't forget the love they had shared, the promise of something beautiful that had now been torn apart. He tried to move on, but the damage lingered, a reminder of how fragile trust really was. As for Jessica, the 15 years she had been sentenced to felt like a lifetime, but it was nothing compared to the lifetime of regret that she would carry with her every single day. She would never get back the life she had lost, the life she had thrown away for the sake of a lie. Time in prison gave Jessica no relief. Each day, she wrestled with the haunting thought, if she had only told the truth, if she had faced the fear of losing Nicholas, things could have been different. Maybe, just maybe, they could have worked things out. But that was a dream now, a painful memory of the life she had destroyed. Jessica's story became a cautionary tale, a story of how a single lie, no matter how well-intentioned, can destroy everything. It was a stark reminder that truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the dangerous comfort of deception. And for Jessica, the price of her deception was a life lived behind bars, separated from the world she had once known and the future she had once dreamed of. What do you think about Jessica's story? Do you think her actions were driven purely by desperation, or was there something more at play? Could she have fixed things without resorting to such extreme measures? And how do you think Nicholas will move forward after everything that's happened? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. We would love to hear your perspective on this heartbreaking story. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories and deep dives into the psychology of criminal behavior. Your support helps us bring more stories to light. Let us know, how far would you go to keep a relationship together, and when does love become obsession?